Good afternoon, and welcome to Class 3 in our program, Talmud for the Curious. Today, I will continue to discuss the development and the architecture of Talmud. I will discuss Rashi, the great Jewish scholar whose work is indispensable to understanding Torah and Talmud. I will discuss Rashis Script, a special font used in Talmud. Then we'll discuss other commentators, the Tosafists, and their unique contribution to Talmud. Then we see how rabbis in the Talmud talk to other rabbis who lived centuries apart. Over the last 2 weeks, I discussed how the oral law was given to Moses on Mount Sinai, along with the written Torah. It was passed down orally until year 200, when Judah the prince wrote down the oral law following Roman persecution. Once the oral law was written down, it became the Mishna, and rabbis began debating and commenting on the Mishna. And over the next 300 years, these debates were written down and became the Gemara, which is the first and most important commentary on the Mishnah. First slide, please. When we open the Talmud, we find letter A, the Mishnah, the oral law. Then we see letter B, the Gemara, the most important commentary on the Mishnah, which was written in Babylonia in Aramaic from years 200 to 500. The Mishnah and the Gemara together become the Talmud. These core texts are surrounded by two major commentaries. On the right side of the page, we see letter C, the commentary of Rashi. On the left side of this page, we see letter D, Tosafot commentaries, which I'll speak about shortly. The page is surrounded by letter E, which are commentaries of less importance, which we will ignore. We're only interested in the three middle columns, D, AB, and C. Next slide, please, Jenny. As we see on this schematic page, the book binding is the reference point for Rashi and Tosafot commentaries. Rashi is always on the side of the page closest to the binding. Tosafot are always on the outside margin of the page, away from the binding. So Rashi and Tosafot may be on different parts of the page, depending on what side of the page you're looking at. Next slide, please. Depending on where Rashi and Tosafot are placed on the page, you can also tell what side of the page or daf we're on. If Rashi's on the right, like this colored page, then we're on the front or olive side of the page. If Rashi were on the left, then we would be on the back or bet side of the page. Letter C is Rashi, and that's where we begin today. Slide off, please. Rashi is an acronym formed by taking the first letters of the name of Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki or Rashi. This medieval scholar was born in France and lived from 1040 to 1105. He was the greatest biblical and Talmudic commentator of all time. Rashi wrote his commentaries on Talmud and Torah in simple language, using the fewest words possible. Rashi was a great explainer. He explains obscure language and grammar as he walks you through the text. He fills in missing information to help you understand the text and explains the structure of each passage phrase by phrase. Many of the Talmudic explanations Rabbi Magal discussed earlier come from Rashi. For example, when the Mishna says you can recite the Shema prayer until the end of the first watch, it was Rashi who explained that a watch was 1/3 of the night. When the first complete Hebrew Bible was printed in the early 16th century, Rashi's commentary was already included. Rashi's commentary became so popular that there are now more than 200 additional commentaries on his commentary. His commentaries have been printed in essentially every version of Talmud since the 16th century. Some of Rashi's commentaries were incomplete when he died and were completed by his students and family members after his death. As we saw in Rabbi Magal's discussions, the Mishnah and Gemara are written in terse language, without explanation, without punctuation. Rashi explained these discussions in simple to understand language and made the Talmud accessible to students and non-scholars. Rashi became an instant bestseller, and to this day, if you want to study Talmud, you have to study Rashi's commentary at the same time. So why do we need commentators or explainers? Next slide, please. This is a page from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in 14th century English. We are now 7 centuries later, and look how difficult this is to decipher. Imagine trying to understand texts that are 1,000 or 2,000 years old, written in archaic Hebrew and Aramaic. That's why we need Rashi. Slide off, please. Rashi's Talmud commentary spread quickly. He died in France at the beginning of the 12th century, and by 50 years later, it had already reached Jews as far away as Yemen. He set the standard for Jewish scholarship and interpretation. Without Rashi's commentary, the Talmud would have remained a closed book. It has been said that anyone from age 5 to 105 can understand Rashi's commentaries. Rashi had 3 daughters, all of whom married Talmud scholars. They, along with Rashi's grandson, wrote additional commentaries about their father-in-law and their grandfather, Rashi. In any school that teaches Talmud or Torah, whenever there's a question about what the text says, the first question is, what does Rashi say? So here's a 5-minute video that we'll see on Rashi.
Trying to read the Torah or Talmud before the 11th century would be like trying to read a poem written in Old English. The characters were unfamiliar, the references obscure, and the story hard to make out. Amidst the violent First Crusade, a Jewish scholar known as Rashi illuminated a path for the Jews of Ashkenaz who, without him, might have been lost to the Dark Ages. At the onset of the First Crusade in the 11th century, rulers such as Leo III of Constantinople had long been converting Jews. By the time Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, better known as Rashi, was born in 1040 in Troyes, conversions under the threat of death were a regular terror for non-Christians. Rashi was determined, even at a young age, to be a guiding light for his people. At 17, he went to a yeshiva in Worms, Germany, before relocating to Mainz, where he studied under the leading sages of the time. From his teachers, Rashi absorbed the oral traditions pertaining to the Bible and Talmud as they would have been passed down, teacher to student, for generations. At age 25, Rashi returned to his hometown of Troyes and became a professional vintner to support himself financially. Like harvesting wine from grapes, Rashi continued to harvest meaning from the Torah and Talmud and was eventually invited to join the rabbinical court, a prestigious entity responsible for handling legal queries. At age 30, he founded his own yeshiva, where he wrote commentary on the Torah and Talmud that would become his life's legacy. Rashi's writing style was as singular, unique, and humble as he. Drawing on the breadth of Jewish law, literature, and Hebrew grammar, Rashi clarified the simple meaning of the text so that even a wise child could understand it. Simultaneously, his commentary formed the foundation of profound legal discourse and mystical dialogue that came after it. His commentary is also imbued with a profound humility. "I admit that I don't know what this verse wants to tell us," he comments more than once. When the First Crusade, the People's Crusade, swept through Europe in 1096, Rashi was 55 years old. Pope Urban II called on Christians to free Jerusalem from the infidels. En route to battle for the control of Israel, a group of unofficial Christian crusaders burned and pillaged their way through the Rhine and the Danube, threatening the thousands of Jews who lived there. "Accept baptism and you will live," they promised to the Jews that were gathered like cattle in the town square. "Burn and die if you do not." Fortunately, Rashi's hometown of Troyes was untouched by the Crusades, but Mainz and Worms suffered devastating destruction and death. You can feel Rashi's anguish in his writing from this period. In his opening commentary on Genesis, he establishes the Jewish claim to the land of Israel. The claim couldn't have been more timely considering what the Christians were crusading for. Against this backdrop of destruction, Rashi's creativity was boundless. In the last 10 years of his life, Rashi produced more writings than in any other period, though his health rapidly declined in the final years. Before his commentary was completed, he passed away in 1105. Rashi had no sons, and his legacy was carried on by his daughters, via their husbands, who were rabbis that completed his work and spread his teachings. Interestingly, there is evidence that Rashi's daughters taught Torah to local women. and served as models for the proper performance of Jewish rituals. There was something Rashi would likely have supported given his stance as a protector and defender of the rights and privileges of women. Nothing probably would have surprised the humble Rashi more than to know that his influence didn't just survive, but, in fact, prospered after his death. Today, any person who opens up a Talmud will find the main text in the center of the page, surrounded by two commentaries, one penned by Rashi on the inside margin, and one on the outside margin, written by Rashi's very own grandchildren and disciples, known as the Ba'alei Tosafot. The years following Rashi's death were marked by difficulty. In 1240, thousands of Talmuds were burned in Paris. In 1306, Jews were expelled from northern France. And in 1348, the Black Plague ravaged Europe, leaving survivors to use Jews as scapegoats. In spite of this dark age, Jewish schools, scholars, and communities found a way forward, guided by the light and love of Rashi's wisdom. The great Hasidic Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi wrote that Rashi's commentary on Torah is the wine of Torah. It opens the heart and uncovers one's essential love and awe of God.
A good way to think about Rashi is to imagine yourself entering a huge auditorium with hundreds of people all talking at the same time, arguing across the room, up and down the balconies, a cacophony of conversations that you cannot understand. Then an old man comes over and taps you on the shoulder and whispers in your ear and points to one person saying, "That rabbi asked a question about a marriage contract and that other rabbi answered him, but the third rabbi over there disagreed and he said," and that's Rashi's job, to help understand what is going on in the auditorium, which is really one page of Talmud. Rashi composed his commentaries in standard Hebrew, but on the Talmud page, which was first printed centuries after Rashi's death, Rashi's commentaries are printed in a special typeface or special font, which we call Rashis Script. Next slide, please. This is a close-up of a Talmud page. In the center text box in yellow, we see the Mishna and the Gemara, which are printed in standard square block Hebrew letters. To the right of the center text in green is Rashi's commentary. And to the left of the center text, also in green, is another commentary, Tosafot, which we'll discuss shortly. We see the text font in both green sections is different than the standard text in the yellow section. And this green section is Rashi's script. The print is softer, more curvaceous. It resembles handwritten or cursive Hebrew script. Slide off, please. Rashi never used this typeface himself. Rashi's script was given its name centuries after Rashi died. It was named for him because it first appeared in a printed book of Rashi's Torah commentary, published by a Jewish printer in Italy in the late 15th century. The publisher came from a Spanish Jewish family, and the Rashi script he designed was based on the handwriting of Spanish Jews who lived under Muslim rule at that time. You can see the Arabic influence on the Hebrew letters in Rashi's script. Next slide, please. Most of Rashi's script characters are similar to ordinary Hebrew. Of these Hebrew letters, only 4 Rashi script letters differ significantly. In the upper right corner, look at the first letter, Aleph, which is different than the square block Aleph. Now look at the lower left corner, next to the last letter, the Shin, which is also different from the square block Hebrew letter Shin next to it. Most of the other letters are recognizable as Hebrew letters. Slide off, please. Printers use this Spanish Hebrew typeface or Rashi script like we use modern day italics to separate the Rashi and the Tosafot commentaries from the center Talmud text where the standard square typeface was used. As happened before, no sooner had Rashi completed his Talmud commentaries than other rabbis had their own comments about Rashi's comments, and they added another layer to Talmud. These debates and commentaries on Rashi's work are known as Tosafot, or additions. And the rabbis who wrote these Tosafot additions are called Tosafists. the ones that added to Rashi. The Tosafot was written mostly by rabbis in France and Germany in the 12th through 14th century. The most famous of the Tosafists was Rashi's grandson, who frequently disagreed with his grandfather. By this time, the original text was 1,000 years old and had never been codified or indexed. And if you wanted to find a discussion on a particular topic, you had to search through the entire Talmud to find where the different Talmud discussions were located. So the Tosafists added something new to Talmud. They pulled out different discussions from different sections of the Talmud, and they compared them and pointed out contradictions and disagreements between different parts of the Talmud. They tried to find solutions, and sometimes they explained passages differently than Rashi. They took thousands of isolated pages and turned them into one unified whole. Just like the Gemara discussed and explained the Mishna, the Tosafists explained, codified, and analyzed the entire Talmud. Now, let's put it all together. We have spoken about dialogues and conversations across the page and across the centuries. Now, let's see what we mean by that. Jenny, please. B, the Gemara, written in Aramaic in the 3rd through 6th century in Babylonia, talks to or references A, the Mishnah, which was written in 200 by Judah the Prince. Next slide. C, Rashi's commentaries, written in 11th century France in Hebrew Rashis Script, talks to or discusses A, the Mishnah, and B, the Gemara. Next slide. D is Tosafot commentary, written from the 12th through the 14th century in France and Germany. This is also printed in Hebrew Rashi script and talks to or discusses A, the Mishnah, B, the Gemara, and C, Rashi's commentaries. But the Tosafot did something extraordinary and innovative and took Talmud to a different level. Next slide. Previously, A and B and C looked only at a flat, two-dimensional page, discussing only what is on that page. But now, Tosafot began to analyze, synthesize, and codify the entire Talmud. The lower arrow on the left side, which turns back on the page, signifies that the Tosafists looked backwards and forwards across all of Talmud to find inconsistencies, contradictions, and problems with the text. They could talk to Rashi, letter C, and say, Grandpa, 200 pages ago, you said something that contradicts what you're saying here. I think you're wrong, and the real answer should be such and such. Also, as noted by the straight arrow going up and off the page, Tosafists were able to reach out to other Jewish texts, for example, to quote what Maimonides said in a different book altogether. Next slide, Jenny. So here, we combine the last two Tosafot slides to see all that Tosafot can do. Tosafists were able to look at the current page in Talmud, A, Mishnah, B, Gemara, C, Rashi, and also look forward and backward throughout the Talmud, and also look completely in separate Jewish works and bring these outside documents into the Talmud. Slide off, please. So from a straightforward Talmud consisting of thousands of individual pages, Tosafists were able to intertwine and weave these previously unconnected pages into a three-dimensional master creation that looked across time, going backwards and forwards through the Talmud, and looked into space at different source materials and books. The Tosafists turned individual Talmud pages into an interconnected web of law and commentaries. They helped synthesize the Talmud into the living document that we have today. Next slide, please. Now, putting all of these slides together, we see how each separate section talks to, converses, or discusses other sections, even though these different sections were written centuries apart in different countries and a different language. B talks to A, C talks to A and B, D talks to A and B and C, and talks to other Talmud pages, and talks to other Jewish reference texts. Next slide, please. Now let's look at how these texts were taught to Jewish students. The Jewish yeshiva student would begin studying Torah at age 5. The student would begin studying Mishna at age 10. Gemara study would begin at age 14. All of these studies were aided by Rashi's commentaries. Tosafot is difficult and is usually studied by advanced students. It is said that one who is familiar with Gemara and Rashi and Tosafot is certainly a Talmudic scholar. Next slide, please. Last year, this is a slide taken from a lecture by Dr. Henry Abramson, whose face you see there. He's a Jewish educator who has literally scores of lectures about all topics of Jewish history, and very interesting. Last year, I would have passed by this old photo without thinking about it. But let's look at this photo again now and see what we've learned. First, we see that these are 3 yeshiva boys studying a large book with 3 columns of text. So they're probably studying Talmud. Then we see that they're studying the middle text box on the page, which we know contains Mishnah followed by Gemara. We know that Mishnah study began at age 10 and Gemara study began at age 14. Since it looks like these boys are maybe 10 or 11, we can deduce that these boys are probably studying a Mishnah, an oral law in a yeshiva. They could even be studying the same Mishnah Rabbi discussed about when to say the Shema prayer. We see there are 2 columns surrounding the Mishnah that they're looking at. One column is Rashi, one is Tosafot. We know that Rashi is always the commentary closest to the binding of the book, closest to the heart of Talmud. And we know that the Tosafot commentary is always the column along the outside margin of their book. We also see the little tabs stuck in the sides of the book pages at the bottom of the page, bottom of the picture. We know how difficult it is to find something in Talmud, so they or the students before them tabbed or indexed the pages in Talmud they were interested in. So now when we look at this photo, we can see how much we have learned and how far we have come in Talmud. Next slide. Talmud is a multilingual, multinational, multi-generation document created by sages and rabbis, which guided the Jewish people for millennia. I'm not going to discuss this slide, and I'll add it to an email that I'll send to you. Slide off, please, Jenny. So today we discussed Rashi, the most important and indispensable commentator on Torah and Talmud. We discussed the Tosafists, who came after Rashi, who helped synthesize and integrate the Talmud into a 3-dimensional living document. In the first 3 weeks of this class, I discussed the development and architecture of Talmud, and we have now learned how to swim in the sea of Talmud. Next week, as we begin the second half of the course, I will discuss what Talmud meant to Judaism throughout the ages. So now I will stop here and turn the program over to Rich.
Thank you, Sheldon. First, I was very excited that he was a vintner, because I don't know if you're going to give the history of Manischewitz and Morgan David Wine. I don't know if Rashi had anything to do with that. He sounded like he could have, because he did everything else. So thank you, Sheldon. We're going to change gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about the book that the Catholic Church in particular loved to hate. That is the Talmud, banned, censored, and burned. And we're going to have to discuss this in light of, some of you took the anti-Semitism course, so some of the stuff may be a little bit familiar. From its earliest days, Christianity worked to separate itself from Judaism. It felt it needed to assert its superiority. The church was, after all, the new Israel, and early church writings discuss God's rejection of the Jews. Augustine of Hippo, or Saint Augustine, kind of summed it up when he said, It was the will of God to keep a remnant of the Jews alive in a degraded state as living witnesses of the Christian truth. If only the Jews could be made to recognize the errors of their ways and convert to Christianity, the world would be wonderful and all could be forgiven. But what was the main obstacle preventing them from this happening? It must be something that they learn. But as the church accepts the Hebrew Bible, what other book is central to Judaism? Well, now we know. It's the Talmud. So attacks on the Talmud commenced in earnest soon after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in 313. The earliest attack goes back to the 6th century, when the Emperor Justinian, you may have heard of the Justinian legal code, attempted to strip Judaism of its rights. The code states, quote, "But the Mishna, or as they call it, the second tradition, we prohibit entirely, for it is not part of the sacred books, nor is it handed down by divine inspiration through the prophets, but the handiwork of man, speaking only of earthy things, and have nothing of the divine in it." If only they would convert. One of the ways to do this became very popular in the Middle Ages, and that was to have a public disputation between Catholic clergy and Jews, with the goal of getting the Jews to admit the errors of their way and, of course, convert to Christianity. This happened multiple times, but the most famous were in Paris, Barcelona, and Tortosa. We're going to talk briefly about Paris. Initially, the medieval church did not take the Talmud very seriously. And they used it to mock Jews for their lack of religious sophistication. That began to change in 1236 with the appearance of Nicholas Donin in the court. And what you're going to find in the next few minutes when I talk, it is apostate Jews that led the persecution. These were Jews who, for whatever reasons, usually very self-serving reasons, left Judaism and converted to Christianity. So Donin translated the Talmud and claimed that the Talmud was much worse than mere foolishness. In matter of fact, it was harmful and blasphemous and should not be tolerated. And as a result of urgings from the Pope, King Louis IX of France put the Talmud on trial. And let me tell you, this was the O.J. Simpson show of the 13th century. All the Paris luminaries, the bishops, the nobility, they all showed up for the trial. And this, again, was led by Nicholas Donin, who was a former rabbinic student who had been expelled. And the arguments that Donin used were somewhat based on a continuation and a development of anti-Talmudic arguments from a Jewish sect called the Karaites. I will not go into too much detail. I would defer to the rabbi, but this was a Jewish sect that rejected oral law and rabbinic interpretations. They rejected Talmud. They observed only the Hebrew Bible. There are still some surviving Karaites today. From what I read, there is a reasonably sized community in Los Angeles, of all places. So this has not completely gone away. And of course, the ground rules were such that the Jews had one hand behind their back because there were certain strict limits on what the rabbis could say or could not say. The debate started on June 12th, and Donin presented 35 charges of allegedly blasphemy. So he picked out things in the Talmud, took them out of context, and he said these things permitted Jews to kill non-Jews, to deceive Christians, and to break promises made to them without any scruples. And the purpose, as I said, of this trial was to get the Jews to eventually admit the errors of their ways and embrace Christianity. There is no evidence that the Jews were convinced. The four rabbis didn't change their mind. But it didn't really matter because the verdict was a foregone conclusion. the Talmud was condemned by the court. This verdict set in motion a train of very tragic events, which culminated in the burning of Jewish holy books on June 17th, 1242. By the accepted estimate, 24 wagon loads of Jewish books, 10,000 manuscripts. Think about it. This was back in the time before the printing press. All of these books were handwritten. Many of them were the only copy in existence, and they were all burnt, gone. This stimulated mass burnings throughout Western Europe over many centuries by the Catholic Church. It didn't only end there. The Talmud became a target of the Inquisition. The Grand Inquisitor, Torquemada, who, by the way, probably had Jewish roots, burned Hebrew books by order of Ferdinand and Isabella. We remember them. That's the nice couple who sent Columbus to discover the New World, right? So he burned more than 6,000 volumes that were infected with Jewish errors. And after Isabella and Ferdinand kicked all the Jews out in 1492, something else happened besides Columbus sailing the ocean blue. All Jewish books were confiscated. The Inquisition also worked hard to find any Jewish contamination in those Jews who converted and remained in Spain. A small aside, just so we know it was equal opportunity by the Catholic Church, the remaining Islamic population in Spain were also forced to convert to Catholicism, and any Muslim books they could find were also confiscated and burned. A new pope, a new policy. In 1564, a delegation of French rabbis appealed to the Pope not to destroy Hebrew texts. The Pope modified his stance. All Jewish books would have to be inspected by Christian monks who could read Hebrew. These censors would remove any material they deemed harmful to Christianity, and only the edited books would be permitted. They were not allowed to have the word Talmud printed on the frontispiece of the book. This type of censorship of Jewish works by the Catholic Church went on for hundreds of years. Most standard copies of Talmud today still reflect the work of the censor's pen and have pieces missing. Fortunately, these expurgated passages were not totally lost. They were published in a book called Sharonos Hashas, which was published in 1704, and many newer versions of Talmud have the redacted pieces in the margins. So fortunately, the Jews were able to save, and we have some of the original Talmudic passages. The Catholic Church was riddled with corruption, nepotism, and degradation. There was finally a reaction. In 1517, Martin Luther, a German priest and scholar, famously nailed his piece of paper containing 95 arguments to the church in Wittenberg, Germany. Thus began the Protestant Reformation, which changed the path of religion in Europe for the next few hundred years. Why do we care? How did the Jews fit in? We're going to watch a 5-minute video.
While 16th century Europe was bursting with innovation, life for the Jews had remained unstable, marked with violence perpetrated by a corrupt Catholic Church. Inspired by an era of innovation and disgusted by the malfeasance of the Church, a monk named Martin Luther sparked one of the largest revolutions in the history of Christianity and permanently altered the course of Judaism. In the early 16th century, after a string of popes embroiled themselves in scandal, the Catholic Church was overrun with corruption. Even though officially the Church took on a vow of poverty, the Church tyrannically acquired money to finance its numerous projects. Perhaps the worst of these schemes was the sale of indulgences, a policy which allowed money to be exchanged for forgiveness from sin and access to heaven. Disillusionment with the Catholic Church reached an all-time high when Martin Luther decided that Reformation was necessary. After spending the first part of his life as a monk and devoting himself to fasting and long hours in prayer, pilgrimage, and confession, Luther reached the conclusion that the Catholic Church had lost its way. In 1517, at the age of 34, he gathered his proposed reformations into a document titled the 95 Theses and nailed it to the front doors of the cathedral in Wittenberg. His core principle was that the Bible itself, rather than the priest's or pope's interpretation of it, was the single highest authority. Instead of confessing to a priest, he believed that every Christian could communicate with God directly. As fame of the 95 Theses spread, Luther's growing reputation allowed him to preach about his other scholarly and philosophical disagreements with the Church, the Catholic Church's exploitation of indulgences, a Christian's relationship with God and their priest, and the complex connection between faith and reason. The Catholic Church, in turn, retaliated by trying him for heresy in 1521. Rather than silencing him, however, this act simply propelled his fame and success. He returned to Wittenberg and began practicing Protestantism, a new movement aimed at both returning Christianity to its biblical roots and modernizing it to match the progressive era of the Renaissance. At first, the Jews had high hopes for the Protestant movement. Life in 16th century Europe had been a gamble for them at best, marked with sporadic waves of violence that could be triggered by anything from the outbreak of plague to the whims of local politicians. Since returning the church to its biblical roots was at the core of the Protestant movement, this new movement created great potential for common ground with the Jews. Luther believed that Christians should build deep relationships with Jews in order to accurately convey Jesus' love. He also understood the Jews' reluctance to convert to Catholicism, since it was riddled with corruption and misinterpretation of the Bible. If I had been a Jew and had seen such dolts and blockheads govern and teach the Christian faith, I would sooner have become a hog than a Christian. But unfortunately, this new alliance didn't last, and Luther's positive attitude to the Jews drastically changed. Just like the Catholics, Luther wanted to have one all-embracing Christian church and believed that his return to a pure biblical Christianity would inspire the Jews to convert to his new faith. Following a similar path to Mohammed almost 1,000 years earlier, his conversion mission failed, and Martin Luther's anti-Semitism revealed itself. By 1543, Martin Luther published On the Jews and Their Lies, a 60,000-word anti-Semitic treatise. He advocated for setting synagogues on fire, confiscating Jewish prayer books, forbidding rabbis from preaching, and smashing Jews' homes. As Protestantism swept through Western Europe, bringing anti-Semitism with it, many Jews were confronted with the violent plundering, destruction, and murder of pogroms that had become all too familiar to them. Many fled to Eastern Europe, to the areas that Protestantism hadn't reached. Jews in Germany, France, and the Netherlands, where Protestantism was most fervent, suffered the most. The biggest tragedy of the Protestants' antagonism towards the Jews is that the two groups initially had so much in common. Many Protestant sects saw the law and values of ancient Jewish society as a basis for the creation of a model modern society. In 1775, for example, the Protestant president of Harvard echoed this sentiment. The Jewish government, according to the original Constitution, which was divinely established, if considered merely in a civil view, was a perfect republic. Luther's legacy of anti-Semitism would live on far after him, manifesting most grotesquely as some of the core literature and teachings of Nazism. His work was often quoted by Hitler and corrupt religious figures. In 1938, for example, a bishop in the Evangelical Church distributed a pamphlet called Martin Luther and the Jews, Away with Them. The pamphlet claimed that the Nazis were acting as true Christians, precisely as Luther would have wanted. Although the 16th century Jews would rebuild after the initial spread of Protestantism, Western Europe would never again be an epicenter for the Jews. Instead, Eastern Europe, Poland, Lithuania, the Ukraine, and Russia subsequently emerged as the heart of European Jewish life and would see a flourishing unmatched since the time of the Second Temple.
Anti-Jewish and anti-Talmudic books continued to spread. one of the greatest attackers was a fellow we're going to talk about for a moment, Johann Eisenmanner, who was born in Germany in 1654. He was educated in England. He studied and learned Hebrew. And to me, what is most amazing, he spent 19 years essentially undercover, studying with leading rabbis, pretending to be interested in converting. He read the entire Talmud 3 times. He ultimately became a university professor of Hebrew and Aramaic in Heidelberg. In 1700, he published his magnus opus, Judaism Unveiled. The book is 2,000 pages in length. It quotes extensively from many Jewish books, including the Talmud. And he makes all kinds of allegations. Jews are commanded to take false oaths, to murder children who have converted to another faith, to test medications on Christians and sell them rotten meat. So Johann Eisenmanner, to me, it's amazing that somebody would spend 2 decades of their life. He undoubtedly gained a great deal of knowledge, but was blinded by his prejudice against and his hatred of Jews. The Nazis would often refer back to his work and his allegations. The persecution of the Talmud continued during the Soviet Union. For its 70 years of existence, you were not allowed to print Talmuds. The Bolsheviks banned the printing of all Jewish religious texts. And it's kind of ironic considering how many Jews were involved in the early movement. The positive thing is that there is a publishing house in Russia, which is in the process of working on publishing the entire Talmud in Russia. It will take 10 to 12 years. They're about halfway done. And lastly, I want to talk about one other fellow called August Rowling. In the 19th centuries, this wasn't that long ago, he was also a professor of Hebrew antiquities in Prague. He published the Talmud Jew. Filled with anti-Semitic and anti-Talmudic tropes, it went through 17 editions. It was a bestseller. It sold over 200,000 copies in Austria alone. It became the standard work of anti-Semitism that was widely quoted in the German Catholic press. Rowling prefaced his allegations by making a bet. He offered 1,000 essentially gold coins if, quote, Judah managed to get a verdict from the German Association of Orientalists that Rowling's quotations were not true. The challenge was taken up by Rabbi Joseph Block, who countered, and he offered to pay Rowling 3,000 gold coins if Rowling could publicly prove he was able to read even a single page of Talmud. Accusing Rowling of ignorance and perjury, Block dared him to bring a libel suit against him. Because of his professional standing, Rowling tried but could not evade the issue, and he finally charged Block with libel in a civil court. The trial was to open in November 18th, 1885, but before the hearings began, Rowling, afraid of being exposed about his lies and his inability to study Talmud, withdrew the charges. The court sentenced him to pay the cost of the trial, and disgraced, he retired from teaching. This didn't happen that long ago. He lived until 1931. He never recanted any of his disproven allegations. And if you go online, you can still buy his book. But to end on a somewhat positive note, there are no more disputations. The church in 1965 published a relation on non-Christian religions, Notra Asate. This is a document in which the church finally, after 2,000 years, declared the abandonment of its anti-Jewish heritage and expressed its desire to reconcile with Judaism. This landmark document repudiated anti-Semitism, and the charge that the Jews were collectively guilty for the crucifixion of Christ. It only took 2,000 years and hundreds of thousands of dead people before the church came around. Thank you. And now I'm going to turn the program over to the rabbi.
Wow, I need a minute to just sort of clear the air. I need
something sweet.
I'm going to bring you something sweet. So everyone take a sip of water or a little l'chaim if you've got some schnapps near you. I have a date. Thank you, Jenny. Something sweet. Take a cookie. Take something nice to clear the air. Oh, because there's so much positive that I want to bring to you after all of that negativity. Wow. I really have to thank Sheldon and Richard for their wonderful research. I also have to say that I'm glad I live in this time and age when I, as a woman, can teach Talmud, and you, as free citizens, can study it without worry or fear. Imagine there were times where this could be upon pain of death what we're doing, and we'd have to hide. So just feel free. Everybody just move your arms. I want everyone to feel really free. And it's good to stretch. You've been sitting for quite a while. And I have something very, very lovely to show you, which I could only do today. The timing is just wonderful. And this is the new moon of Adar, the new moon of the month of Adar. And I found a Talmud quote, which begins with, when the month of Av enters, we reduce in joy, in the Mishna. And
Rabbi, could I interrupt you for a second? You've got a box on your screen that could be closed.
Who does?
Oh, there it is. Okay, it's gone now. I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
And the Gemara wants to add, when the month of Adar enters, Misha Nichnas Adar, increase in happiness, Marbin L'Simcha. And the translation isn't exactly accurate. It doesn't say we increase. It means there is a big increase in joy. And so the question is there something in the air when this month comes in that we're sort of feeling? Is that an energy that's just out there? Or is it something that we need to make a decision? We are going to now find happiness and joy, very much like we do at Sukkot when we have the harvest festival and we say, this is the time of joy and gratitude. So there's something about our religion that says this is a time for sadness, this is a time for joy. And we as a community enter that emotion. Even if it's contrary to what's going on in our life, we understand that the community is entering a kind of dance together. And Chag, actually, the word for festival in Hebrew, comes from a circle dance. So we're all in the circle dance starting today and tomorrow as well. It's also a 2-day Rosh Chodesh, new moon ceremony. And I really invite anyone listening today to come to Minyan tomorrow. There are a few of our regulars who are out of town and not able to come. And we need to have a Minyan so that we can say Hallel, which is a set of Psalms, especially for the new moon. So I hope to see more people tomorrow at 8:30 on my Kesher link. Please, please come. All right. Now back to the Talmud sections that I wanted to bring to you. Besides the time of the year, I'm showing something now from Hanukkah. We spoke before about two schools of thought. Beit means house or school of Hillel, and Beit Shamai. Hillel was usually more lenient, Shamai more strict, but they both had logic, and they always wanted to listen to each other's commentary so that they could understand the other side's logic. So the sages taught in a baraita, which is something that wasn't written down, but it was an oral tradition handed down. Again, the bold relates to the words in Aramaic, and the in between is to make it more of a sentence in English. The basic mitzvah of Hanukkah is each day to have a light kindled by a person. We have all lit Hanukkah candles, correct? Now, how did it come to be? The head of the household for himself and his household. And the mehadrin, we would translate that as those who are meticulous in the performance of a mitzvah, kindle a light for each and everyone in the household. Many of us have more than one Chanukiah, and we like to have each person light. And the mehadrin min ha-mehadrim, even more meticulous, they adjust the number of lights daily. So big argument, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagree as to the nature of that adjustment. Here's what Beit Shammai says. Okay, on the first day, kindle 8 lights. You've got a full tank, so to speak. And from there on, you gradually decrease the number of lights until on the last day, you kindle 1 light. Imagine if you had so much oil, just like so much gas in your car, as you drive or as you go through the holiday, you have less and less. So there's incredible logic there, right? And Beit Hillel says, no, on the first day you kindle 1 light, and from there on you increase 1, and then 2, and then 3, until on the last night you have 8 lights. So Amar Ula, Rab Ula said, well, there were 2 Amoraim, commentators in the West. Anytime they say West, they mean Israel, because Babylonia was far to the east. They disagreed on this dispute, and here are 2 rabbis. One said that Beit Shammai's opinion is that the number of lights correspond to the incoming days, in other words, the future. On the first day, 8 days remain, one kindles 8 lights. On the second day, 7 days remain, you kindle 7. And they thought the reason for Beit Hillel's opinion is that the number of lights correspond to the outgoing days, those that have already gone. And in case that was confusing, Rashi gave an explanation. We had a beautiful section on Rashi today, so you understand. He's in France, and he's explaining the simple meaning. He says this corresponds to the days that enter, that's future, and the days that leave. They're already left, and that which you're standing on, the day you're on, counts with the ones you have left. He always puts it in very simple language. It's not the only reason about the amount of oil or the amount of days, but here is a very good precedent. Each day, the number of lights corresponds to the number of days of Hanukkah that were already observed. Or it could go with Beit Shammai's opinion, corresponding to the bulls of the festival of Sukkot. Did you know that at the festival of Sukkot, there were offerings made for the peoples of the world? 13 bulls, that's a big sacrifice, were sacrificed on the first day, and then every day a little bit less. Now, the reason that it would have anything to do with Sukkot is because if you remember the Hanukkah story, they were fighting in the autumn, and they didn't get to celebrate the holiday, Hechag, the most important holiday. So they did it later after the fighting ended in December sometime at the time of Hanukkah. So they thought of it as a delayed Sukkot celebration that would go on for 8 days. Another precedent, the reason for Beit Hillel's opinion, is that the number of lights is based on the principle, very important principle, one elevates to a higher level in matters of sanctity, of holiness, of kedusha, and you don't go down, you don't downgrade. Therefore, if the objective is to have the number of lights correspond to the number of days, there's no alternative to increasing their number with the passing of each day. You have to increase. You want to increase in joy, in sanctity, in holiness. You don't want to go down. Another rabbi, Rabbi Bar Bahana, said that Rabbi Yochanan said, and this is very often that you'll hear one quoting another. So it's as if you heard it from Anita, who heard it from me, and I heard it from Reb Mel Gottlieb, who heard it from the Kotzker Rebbe. You'd have a whole string of who heard it from whom, because you don't want to do plagiarism. You want to say who you heard it from. There were 2 elders in Sidon. One of them acted in accordance with the opinion of Beit Shammai. One of them acted in accordance with the opinion of Beit Hillel. One went from 8 to 1. One went from 1 to 8. And each provided a reason. Nobody does it stum for no reason. One gave a reason for his actions. The number of lights corresponds to the bulls of the festival, meaning Sukkot. And one gave a reason for his actions. The number of lights is based on the principle one elevates to a higher level in matters of sanctity, and you don't downgrade. So I looked it up in Megillah. There's an order of sanctity, and one elevates to a higher level in matters of sanctity, one does not downgrade. So sometimes the Talmud quotes itself, that different times the same argument will come up in a different application. This one had to do with if a high priest stops being the high priest and he's still alive, or the president of the Sanhedrin or some very high office, he can't be downgraded. He has to still have elements of holiness. The same thing for an old prayer book or an old Torah that can no longer be used for the purpose of prayer or reading the Torah. It can't be just discarded and thrown out, because once it has that level of sanctity, it needs to be honored, and therefore it would be buried in a geniza. It would be buried with in a cemetery with a holy person, and we have done that in our congregation. As a matter of fact, we had it twice that when I had a burial, I put together some of the books that no longer could be used. They were all torn and old, and I buried it with the person. All because of this element here. One elevates to a higher level in Kedusha, in sanctity. So here's an illustration of how Shamai lights the Hanukkah candles. You start with a full contingency of 8. Second, and remember, Hebrew is right to left. So this is 1 and this is 8. So if we're going to go backwards, we're going to go that way. So 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. And on the first day, you only have 1. Wouldn't that be just awful if we did it that way? I'm so glad that this is how the halacha, the ruling goes. First night, first candle. Second night, second, third, fourth, and we're going from right to left. The way we increase, considering ABC, Aleph, Bet, Gimel in Hebrew, goes from right to left. The 5th night, the 6th night, the 7th night, the 8th night. I'm going to stop sharing so that you can get an even better idea of the relationship of lighting candles and the holiday of Sukkot and Beit Shammai's thinking. Jenny.
In the Talmud, there's a wonderful debate between Hillel and Shamai about how are we supposed to light those candles. Should we start, as Hillel says, lighting 1, on the second night, light 2, on the third night, light 3, until we get all the way up to 8? Or should we do what Shamai said, which is on the first day, light 8 of them, on the second day, light 7, on the third day, light 6, so that each day you're reducing instead of adding? And we do actually, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that we go with Hillel and we light the way Hillel said, because Hillel said that you increase in holiness, you don't decrease in holiness. But I want to take a look for a moment at Shammai's argument, because his argument's a really good one. What he says is, if we're modeling Hanukkah on Sukkot, then let's take a look at Sukkot and how the sacrifices were brought at Sukkot. Sukkot is the time when sacrifices were brought for all the nations. So 70 sacrifices were brought. On the first day, you sacrificed most of them, the largest number. The second day, a little less. The third day, a little less. The fourth day, a little less. So what Shammai is saying is, if we're really modeling this on Sukkot, then let's model it on Sukkot. If the Maccabees walked in with lulav and etrog saying, we're going to celebrate Sukkot anyway, then let's really celebrate it, and let's make the candles symbolic of those sacrifices. So on the first day, we would light all of them. On the second day, a little less. On the third day, a little less. So forth. He's not saying let's reduce our holiness. He's saying let's model it on Sukkot. So really, when we look at Hillel and Shammai, they're both making excellent arguments. We couldn't sit there and say, you're more correct in your argument. They're both excellent arguments, but they're both facing different directions. Shammai is looking backwards at what the Maccabees did, and he's saying, let's now do what they did. And that means his head is turned backward, looking at history. Hillel is looking forward. He's saying, let's actually forge a new way that elevates holiness, where what we do, we start with one step and then we move forward to the second, to the third, to the fourth. His head is facing forward to the future. And when we now question, What is the way we want to shape our holidays? Do we want to shape them looking backward at history, so Judaism is all about the history of what used to happen? Or do we want to shape it with our head facing forward, saying Judaism is about tomorrow and what we're going to be able to accomplish and do as we grow? And in that argument, Hillel wins. That we do not sit in Judaism with our head turned backwards, as Shamai said, although it's an argument that can be made, but then we're forever reliving our history, and we're not forging a future. Hillel was arguing for forging our future, and that's the argument that wins.
So that was very interesting. But remember, even if we're looking forward, we are also rooted in the history of what came before. So it's always a balance. How do we stay rooted in tradition and yet look forward to a new way of doing things in our own day? So not only do we talk about how we light, but where we put the Chanukiah, which is the Hanukkah menorah. So the sages taught, again in a baraita, in a remembered oral tradition, it's a mitzvah to place the Hanukkah lamp at the entrance to one's house on the outside so that all can see it. And the Talmud would go on to say, you should do it when people are coming home from the marketplace, at the time when light is going down, so that many people could see it. Lifarsemet hanes, which means to publicize the miracle. Now, if he lived upstairs, remember not everybody lived on the ground floor, he places it at the window adjacent to the public domain. People were supposed to be able to see it outside. Now, after that history lesson that we had this morning, you can imagine there were times when that would be very dangerous. So that is addressed. In a time of danger, when the Gentiles issued decrees to prohibit kindling lights, we place it on the table, and that is sufficient to fulfill the obligation. It had to be hidden. It had to be private. You would draw the curtains and light it inside where only the family could see it. We are lucky in our day that we can again put it in the window and we can proclaim the miracle. We can put, as we did in our house, a lot of blue lights and Hanukkah menorahs so that people from the street could see it. Now, from every lesson from now to the end, I'm going to have a moment where we think a minute, where the light bulb goes off and we go, Rega, choshvim. That's in Israeli educational television. They have that where they stop the skit and they go, just a minute, we're learning. So I'm having a moment of thinking, Rega, choshvim. And my question is, what is the underlying issue in this particular story, and why does the halacha most often go by Bet Hillel? I could give you 25 examples where you have very good arguments by both of those schools of thought, but the halacha, the ruling, most often goes with Bet Hillel. So I have one more story to give you, but before I do that, I want to stop and consider. So I can now see you all, and if you've been in the speaker view, you can go to gallery view. And I can see everybody. There we go. And I'm wondering if anyone has a question or a comment or an answer. And I cannot see everybody at once. So I'm going to look for hands that are up, or maybe you can just shout out.
So Linda, go ahead, Linda.
So I think at one time when we were doing Torah study, this came up. And I think one of your responses was that we follow Hillel. It has something to do until the temple is rebuilt. And then the possibility of going back to Shamai might happen.
Right. So what you're alluding to is that the minority opinion, also with Hillel, Bet Shamai, and other rabbis, is always noted because in the time of the future, we could call it when the third temple is built, or Ba'olam Haba, or in the Messianic age, when things are perfect and we are all filled with holiness and doing all the mitzvot, perhaps we will be able to attain that level of strictness. So that is true. We did study that, and I'm glad you brought it up. But for right now, in the imperfect world in which we live, Beit Hillel has the bottom line answer for the ruling. any other comments on why these things are being discussed, how they're being discussed, and what effect it has on you? Or perhaps you're just surprised that there even is this discussion, that you always thought there was only one way to do it.
Rabbi, it's Michael.
Yes.
First of all, incredibly enlightening, especially lighting all the 8 candles at once. I had never heard that. But it seems to me that the basic tenet here is Hillel's looking to the future and going forward. And you can't go forward if you're going backwards. And since in order to survive in the present, and tomorrow becomes the present, and the next tomorrow becomes the present, you have to look forward. If you don't look forward, you don't have a future. And I would say that's why Hillel is adapted most of the time, even though the other is very reasonable and logical. But for the moment, we're all in survival mode and going forward. The journey always goes forward. It never goes backwards.
Well, I don't know if there's any early or late or forward or backwards. There's sort of no time frame somehow in our tradition, and everything's happening kind of at once, almost in dream language. But it's just very fascinating to read that and to see that there are different ways. I know that Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi of blessed memory, my mentor, he lights both ways. He has 2 menorahs going at once. He really does. I heard that from Eve. So I was going to do another story about the kinds of work that you can and can't do on Shabbat, but I'm going to skip to something just delightful. I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, we had the question, what do we know about these teachings of the rabbis? How are they derived from the laws that Moses brought down? Last week we had the 10 Commandments, and then we had Mishpatim this last Friday about many mitzvot. And how did this all, how do we know what the rabbis did with it? So here's a lovely story. Here's a story about Rabbi Akiva. It's from Menachot, which is in Kedoshim, the book of holy things. Rav Judah said, or Yehuda said, in the name of Rav, again in the name of who he heard it from, when Moses ascended on high to receive the Torah, he found the Blessed Holy One sitting and attaching little crowns to the letters. So Moses wanted to bring the 10 Commandments back to the people, and he thought this was a waste of time. He said, Master of the universe, what is holding you back from giving the Torah? And Rav Yehuda says that Rav said, when Moses ascended on high, he found the Holy One sitting and tying crowns on the letters. And he just thought, give it right now. What's preventing you? And God said to him, there is a man who is destined to be born after several generations. Akiva ben Yosef is his name. He is destined to derive from each and every thorn of these crowns, mounds upon mounds of halachot, of rulings. It is for his sake, Rabbi Akiva, that the crowns must be added to the letters of the Torah. So Moses is still talking to God, and he says, Master of the universe, show him to me. And God, who can, of course, make time travel possible, says to Moses, return behind you. Moses went and sat at the end of the 8th row. Remember last week you saw this bas-relief of rows at the academy? So Moses sat at the very back with the junior students. He sat at the end of the 8th row in Rabbi Akiva's study hall. So he jumped forward in time many generations. He didn't understand a word that they were saying. They're studying, and his strength waned. I mean, it's just like his jaw dropped, his back bent, and he thought, I just don't get this. My Torah knowledge is deficient. When Rabbi Akiva arrived at the discussion of one matter, his students said to him, my teacher, from where do you derive this? And Rabbi Akiva said to them, oh, it's a halacha transmitted to Moses from Sinai. Moses is sitting there and he hears this. He heard this and his mind was put at ease as he understood that this too was part of the Torah that he was to receive. So he understood that the download that he was getting had room in it for all the expansion and all the commentaries that were to come. And this is just such a delightful story. So Moses then returns, comes back up the mountain, and he said, Master of the universe, you have a man as great as this, and yet you still choose to give Torah through me? He's really feeling very humble. And there's kind of a difficult ending to this, but stay with me. And God said, be silent. This intention arose before me. I've thought of this before, he says. And Moses said, Master of the universe, you showed me Rabbi Akiva's Torah. Show me his reward. This is a tough one. God said, return to where you were. Moses went back and saw that they were weighing Rabbi Akiva's flesh in a butcher's shop as Rabbi Akiva was tortured to death by the Romans, part of the story that you're hearing from Sheldon and Richard. And Moses said, Master of the universe, this is Torah and this is its reward. And God said to him, be silent. This intention arose before me. Very difficult discussion is going to continue about what is a reward and what is the world to come and what is it to teach Torah despite a time when it's not allowed. But we won't go into all of that. I wanted to show you those crowns. Certain letters have crowns. Some have 3. Some have only 1. But these are the letters that can have the crowns. And that's how it looks. And you can see the scribe with a quill, pen, and kosher ink putting the crowns on the letters. Again, these are the ones, if you want to remember it, they sort of put them all together, that Shatnez Semer Gedolim. This is a way people remember which letters in the Hebrew alphabet have crowns. And you can also see that they have to be stretched. You see, that's the ultimate justification. We do it with spaces. They did it with stretching or making smaller the letters. All right, so those were all my notes. And yes, I'm going to stop the share right there. I just want to see if I had another, yeah. As we learned, Torah has sometimes a very vague principle, like do no work. So the Mishna says, well, what is work? And then the Gemara goes into more detail about what the Mishna says, so that you get these 39 categories of work where you can't rip or finish or weave or do all the 39 kinds of creative work that were done for the Mishkan, which we're going to be reading about in the Torah portions coming up. So the crowns, each one of them, are perhaps a decoration, and perhaps there's great mystical meaning. And why do you think the story here says that even Moses, the great teacher, didn't know what they were, but later that would develop. It would develop through the years leading up to the Mishnah. It would, and then the years of the Gemara, and then Rashi, and then Tosafot, and all of the commentaries up to our very day would all be based and rooted on the earlier stories, and not only the stories, but what was deduced from them as halachot. Singular is halacha, is a ruling. Halachot is the plural. So what's the bottom line, which we'll learn in the 6th session? How did this play out through time? How did we upgrade our ruling to take into consideration scientific knowledge and the Industrial Revolution and new possibilities, where we have electricity and we have travel in cars where there's no animal that you're traveling on. So really today what I wanted to show you was that there were many opinions that were based on earlier rulings, that were based on earlier holidays, as we saw, Hanukkah based on Sukkot, and also ultimately based on the offerings, based on what was contributed to the time of the tabernacle in the desert, and then the time of the temple in Jerusalem offered by the priests. At this point, they're talking, there is no temple, there's no priesthood, there's no offerings, but it's all been transformed into a way that was updated. It was prayers, it was lighting candles, it was saying certain study patterns. And it was like right now on Rosh Chodesh, honoring the new moon. We no longer have people going outside and witnesses saying, I saw the sliver of the new moon. We have a calendar and we can see the new moon is now on Tuesday and Wednesday, but we're rooted in the ancient, the not only the customs, but the rituals. And so we're constantly rooted in what came before, but updating it for our time. And as Linda Waddell mentioned, maybe we'll be perfected and the time will come where we can be even more stringent in how we apply these mitzvot and these rules. The greatest mitzvah, and it's not really a mitzvah in the looser sense, I would say, is to be joyful and happy as we enter the month of Adar. It's in the Talmud and it's in the songs. It's in our leading up to Purim, which will be in the next month of Adar. We've got 2 months of Adar in this leap year. So we live according to history, according to the calendar, and we're also in the modern world. We are citizens of this country, and we are connected to Israel as the Holy Land. It's very interesting, complex connections that we have, which led, unfortunately, to our being accused of not being loyal. But it also says in the Talmud, Dina de Malchuta Dina, in Aramaic, meaning the law of the land is the law, and you are to be good citizens wherever you are. And we are always, Jews have always been at the forefront of social action wherever we lived. So we want to make the world a better place. We want to do tikkun olam, and we also want to make things better in our own lives, in the lives of our community, collecting coats and food and donating to people way beyond our own borders. But we also want to honor our ancestors and our ancient customs. What an interesting balance, what an interesting tension of ancient and modern, of looking back and looking forward. It's not either or. We know how to hold seemingly paradoxical tensions and say yes and. So very often when you ask me a question, I say you're right, and I say you're right too, and you can't both be right. Well, you're right too. It's both and. So I'm going to end here a little bit early and open it up for comments, reactions, questions, clarifications. And I want to let you know that next week I have something just delicious planned for you as well. All right, I'm going to change my view so that I can see everyone. Anita, I see your hand.
Yeah, will you please expand on how the crowns on the letters allow us to expand depending on the time we're living in or the environment, the culture we're in?
So Diane asked the same question, and I looked ahead at the pages that followed. Well, get this, it never explains what Akiba says, because that's not the important thing. Just like in the oven of Achnai, it never explained what Eliezer's explanations were. The point was, there are parts of the Torah that are mystical, hidden, and will be explained. So some people here are studying the Zohar, which is a mystical work, and just know that we have room for extra explanations. So I'm not going to go into the crowns. I think perhaps you have another idea. Anita, more.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly what it said. And you have my book, Crowns, the Crowns on the Letters. And if you look at what I have, yeah, in the beginning, there's a Post-it. Look at one of the Post-its. I think it's probably the first Post-it, and I don't remember exactly what it says, but it was really wonderful about.
Well, I will. I have added some Post-its myself. So
I think mine were yellow.
Yellow. Okay, let me see. The story of Moses and Rabbi Akiva revolves around the immutability of Torah as the word of God, unchanging, eternal truth. When God attaches crowns to the letters, he does more than merely beautify the text. He embeds in the unchanging text a system through which later authorities will make new applications of old principles. That's what I said. As history unfolds, so do layers of meaning within the text. With each passing generation, including us, more and more of the beauty of Torah will be revealed, bringing to life the crowns on the letters.
So they'll unfold.
Yes, Sheldon.
Yes, Rabbi, can you please explain on some of the Gemara that the screens that you had, it gives the name Ta'anit 29a or Menachot 29b.
Those are the names of the tractates. And
go ahead, I'm sorry.
And each tractate is part of an order. There are 6 orders. Shisha, Sidrei Mishna, Chamisha, Chumshei Torah. When we're singing at Passover, who knows one, Echad Miyodea. So the 6 is Shisha, Sidrei Mishna, 6 orders, and within each order there are so many tractates equaling 63 tractates. So whenever you see Megillah 10b or Menachot or whatever it is, it gives you the name of the tractate, the number of the folio, and AB is the first side or the second side. Thank you for asking. Any other comments or questions on this? Yes, Richard. You need to unmute.
Let me ask you to engage briefly in a little alternative history. There have been groups of Jews that we've encountered, like the Sadducees, as opposed to the Pharisees, and the Sadducees being more aligned with the priestly class, and they didn't really necessarily embrace the oral tradition. And I also came across the Karaites, this other Jewish sect. What would have happened? How would Judaism have evolved differently if the priests still existed, if the Second Temple hadn't been destroyed and we still had a priest? Would we still have a priestly class? Would we still have become rabbinic Judaism? How do you think Judaism would have evolved?
You know, it's so interesting that a tragedy can turn into a transformative benefit. Horrible thing to say, but true. If I don't know how I would feel about having to go to Jerusalem and bring an animal and see it slaughtered and think that that's how I'm connecting with divinity. I think that was a passage in time where we wanted to be one step ahead of the other nations, and animal sacrifice was much better than human sacrifice. But we've gone through, and Maimonides agrees with me on this, that there's a different stage, and that is where prayer, avodah shebalev, the service of the heart, took place of the avodah of the temple, the service through animal and grain and fruit offerings. As a liberal Jew, I would say that I'm not looking forward to the reestablishment of a third temple where there would be actual animal sacrifices. But there are some vestigial honors to the priestly class. So anybody whose name is Cohen or Katz, which means Kohen Tzaddik, a holy priest, or Katzenberg, or many different permutations of that, in a traditional shul will be the first one called up for an aliyah. And a Levite will be the second one. And if there aren't Kohanim and Leviim, they would say Bimkom, in the place of, and they would give it to just a normal Israelite. There, and a Kohen traditionally cannot marry a divorcee and has to get sort of special dispensation somehow. So there are remnants of the lineage. When we descendants of the priests offer the priestly blessing, and that usually is the Kohanim. I know Anita always comes up as a Bat Kohen, and so there's something left in the Pidyon Haben, buying back the firstborn instead of dedicating them to the temple. A Kohen takes the place, just like the Levites took the place of the Reubenites. Reuben was the eldest son, but he ends up not having the lineage of leadership. So there's little remnants. And when we do bikurim, the first fruits, when we celebrate the holidays, we go back to our ancient roots. And so it's more the land, the way we treat food, the way we bless before and after we eat. That is how we have taken the place of what used to be our roots. And we feel a total relationship to that. I, for one, am, I mourn that the temple was destroyed, but I'm also so grateful that we have a new kind of Judaism that we can embrace in our modern age, and that helps us in choices every single day. Choices about birth and death and health and community and every possible roadblock that comes, we will have some teaching that will help us through it. So no, I actually am glad that we're not back there in those times. Also that there are Jews pretty much all over the world, although it's not the way it used to be, but we're constantly evolving. And those of us who have the honor and the holy duty to be alive at this time, we need to ask what our sole purpose is, because there's so many families that were cut off. My mother was the only survivor of her family. So I should have had an uncle and cousins, and I don't. And many of you should have had other relatives, and you don't. So we have to be the ones who are alive in this age to study this material and say, how do I make this live again today in my life, in Sedona, or wherever you are right now?
Thank you.
Any other comments about how this may impact how you celebrate any of the holidays, or how you prepare for the holidays, or how you're aware of the new moon time, because this is an auspicious time to start a new project, and this month to be happy. We got 2 months of happy, and that doesn't mean that you may not have challenges, but look for ways to elevate your joy and the joy of others. There was actually, I studied a little Talmud this morning with my alumni group from my seminary in California, and it was so beautiful because it said, sometimes someone is standing outside at a celebration and they're standing like this and they're sad. You should pull them into the circle and help them dance with you and make them joyful. I thought that was a beautiful teaching. So I'm holding all of you in the circle of dance, and I'm hoping that you're all more joyful than you were before 3 o'clock today, that you learned something from Sheldon and Richard and me and from our teachers of all these generations, and you hear them speak 2,000, 1,000, 100, and a day, and we can all have a conversation through those years. Well, next week, we're going to dive into more of the history, some of it troubling, some of it elevating. I hope you'll come to Minyan Wednesday morning at 8:30 on my Kesher communication. It's on the e-blast every week. Thursday afternoon, Torah study. Friday night, we have 5:30 in our time zone in Arizona services. Isn't it miraculous that we can Zoom and be together and you don't have to leave your room? I think it's fantastic. Look, Nancy's from Malibu, and we've got people, in Prescott and all over the Sedona area. Thank you, Jenny, for making this accessible and easy. And thank each one of you for participating and adding your thoughts to that page. If you added all of us, the page would be very, very wide, and we'd have our own column. It would be X, Y, Z already. So I really am full of gratitude for all of you. And Hubbardsson is there. He brought in our whole family in the background. How delicious. So.
And I'm so proud. I learned so much from you, and you are a brilliant. Come home.
All right, I'll make dinner. I hear you. Simcha Rabba, Aviv Higia. We're not quite at Passover, but at every holiday, there's history, there's nature, there's a mystical message, and there's joy. Shalom, everyone.